Well, hello. Welcome to another Crime Dive. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So, like many others out there, I've decided to make videos about it. If you are also drawn to true crime and you want to feel better about your makeup skills, because unlike all those others, I have no idea what I'm doing, you should absolutely like, subscribe, and let's hang out together every Tuesday where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. So yeah, I'm not sure if it is Tuesday or Thursday when I'm uploading this, but huzzah, I am uploading it. I am very proud that I'm even recording it. Man, there's just been a lot going on lately, just so much. First, we had our cat Cass. We had his, he had some dental work done where he had some teeth removed. Then we got Vex, so that was a lot to deal with. But then our other kitty, my little black kitty, Urza, she did a little cameo in the video last week, was not really dealing all that well with having a new doggo in the house, and so, she didn't eat, she got, really constipated and was, stressing out and stuff, so we had to end up, segmenting our house off so, she could have, a bigger safe space and stuff, and, it's just been a lot to deal with, a lot. But everyone's doing much better now, so thankfully things seem to be okay. And yeah, my whole schedule got completely skewed dealing with Urza and taking care of her. Okay, well, let's continue our look into the Scott Moody case. This is part 3. So in part 3 today, we're going to continue talking about Stacy. I mentioned this last week and I warned y'all, we will be talking about, sexual abuse / sexual assault, because poor Stacy is not done being traumatized, unfortunately. And it's a lot to get into, so be prepared for that. We will also discuss some of the questions that were raised by other professionals in law enforcement that questioned whether we really did know what happened at the Moody Massacre. There were some professionals who were kind of scratching their head and wondering if Scott really was indeed the shooter, and we'll get into that as well. So if you will remember, we ended last week's video talking about the Moody family, Steve, Audrey, and Stacy, and kind of how, they were coping and moving on. They sat down for 2 public interviews and just kind of discussed how their life was going, how Stacy was healing. And that is where we'll pick up today's video. And real quick, before I forget again, as a quick reminder, this is the book I read for this case, Saving Stacy. Here, it'd probably help if I actually put it in frame here. Saving Stacy, The Untold Story of the Moody Massacre by Rob St. Clair. We mentioned briefly this last week, right? The Moodys faced 2 wrongful death lawsuits that were filed by the estates of Paige and Megan. And Rob St. Clair is part of the legal team that defended the Moodys in that suit. I forgot to plug the book last week, and I hate when I do that. So this was the book that I've been reading for this case. So we will pick up with the Moodys and just kind of discuss how they were coping with what was happening, and that is where we will drop in. So Steve and Audrey were doing their best to move forward. We talked about a lot of the home care that Stacy still needed because of her injuries. So, they had a lot on their plate on top of having 3 young boys of their own, you know what I mean? So there's just a lot on their plate. And so they did their best to move forward, all right? They did have some questions nagging at the back of their mind, and they did hear and were well aware of all the rumors and speculation going on around town, right? That Scott couldn't have done this and, everything. And we'll get a little bit more into some of the rumors and stories that were flying around town. But, Steve and Audrey told themselves, well, we're aware of all this talk going on. We're aware that people are saying Scott couldn't have done this and that there's these other explanations and maybe it's some grand conspiracy. But, they told themselves, well, they're law enforcement though. We have to assume that the Logan County Sheriff's Office came to the right conclusions. They're law enforcement. They know what they're doing. And their friends and family sort of echoed these same sentiments. Look, man, you can't listen to rumors going around town. You can't listen to a bunch of armchair detectives who don't have the first clue about, police work or detective work, forensics or anything like that. No, you just need to just focus on healing and moving forward. Scott did this horrible thing. It's awful, but it is what it is. And that's kind of how Steve and Audrey were coping with this, and that's how they had decided to sort of view it. It's like, hey man, like, they're police. They know what they're doing, right? And for a while, this was enough, all right? They, tried to make their peace with it, and we're like, all right, Scott did this, and, they said he did this. We have to take them at their word. This is what they've presented. We have to assume they know what they're doing. And for a while, that was enough for Steve and Audrey. And it wasn't until a police chief contacted Steve and Audrey that they would begin to question everything the Logan County Sheriff's Office had reported and done and said. So Police Chief Ron Murray had contacted the Moodys. Now, Murray here had more credible law enforcement experience in all of Logan County than anyone. He had been working as a police officer since 1977. He had received numerous awards and honors throughout his career, including the National Police Chief's Honor Award. And on top of that, he was certified in pretty much like every conceivable area of law enforcement there was, including homicides and suicides. Like, seriously, the book lists all of Chief Murray's like certifications and like experience in type of cases, and it's like seriously like every type of case that you can think of, including suicides and homicides. So Chief Murray's son and Stacy were friends at school. I'm not sure how close of friends, more like acquaintances or like best friends, not sure. But that is how Chief Murray knew the Moodys. They knew each other kind of casually from church and around town. I've said this numerous times, right? Small area. Many people know everyone, right? So after the autopsy reports had been released, Chief Murray, decided to take a look at the case himself, all right? And it was after he took a look at the case that he contacted Steve and said, hey, you need to meet me at your earliest convenience. I've got some things to discuss with you, And so, that's what Steve did. And, remember, this is a police chief. This is a police detective. This is an investigator. This is someone who has decades of experience. Like, if I was Steve, I would definitely, go and meet this guy too. It's not like this is like some random Joe Blow dude. You know what I mean? Like, this is an actual law enforcement officer. So at the meeting, all right, Chief Murray told Steve that he was going to be blunt. And then he proceeded to show Steve all of the inconsistencies that he found based on the autopsy reports, case files, and everything that the Logan County Sheriff's Office and their detectives had put together. And he went through everything, case files, photos, again, reports from, not just the coroner's office, but from the detectives and stuff. And yeah, after he had reviewed everything, he was definitely quirking an eyebrow, and that was what he was going to share with Steve. So for starters, all right, Chief Murray told Steve that he was kind of disturbed by the placement of Scott's body based on the crime scene photos, along with the placement of the rifle. These two things did not add up to Chief Murray. So as we have discussed, and as was shown in the crime scene photos, Scott was on top of his bed next to Paige. He was halfway down on the bed with his knees bent and his feet on the floor. And remember, we mentioned this, above his head were some blood streaks. And to Chief Murray, these streaks and these patterns that he saw looked to him as if someone had dragged Scott's body and placed him at the end of his bed. And where those like blood streaks / like blood splatters were in a position where Scott's head would have been if he was sleeping in his bed. Murray also wondered if Scott really did shoot himself behind the left ear. That was the first shot, then repositioned himself from the top of the bed to where the investigators found him, halfway down the bed with both of his feet, on the floor. So based on the positioning of Scott's body and those, blood streaks and like blood pattern that was near the top of the bed, Murray theorized that someone else had shot Scott while he was sleeping in bed, with the shooter then repositioning Scott, which required dragging Scott by his feet, dragging him down the bed to place his feet on the floor. So Chief Murray described the scenario to Steve as he saw it, all right? So Chief Murray was looking at these crime scene photos, and based on those blood streaks and like how Scott's body was positioned and knowing what his wounds were, what the two bullet entry and exit wounds were, or exit wound, because I think one of the bullets was still in his brain. Chief Murray then told Steve, like, look, man, when I'm looking at this, all right, as a law enforcement officer, as a detective, this is what I think happened based on these photos. That the first shot had actually come as Scott lay in bed asleep. The shooter then repositioned Scott, pulling him by his feet and dragging him down the half of his bed and putting his feet on the floor, and then shooting him a second time. Now, Murray thought that the first shot probably did kill Scott, but even if that first shot hadn't killed him, Murray questioned whether Scott would even be able to not just shoot himself a second time, but be able to reposition himself from the bed after the first shot came. Murray really didn't think this was likely. And he was really troubled that none of the investigators in any of the reports commented on the positioning of Scott's body. Like, that was another thing that really rubbed him the wrong way. He's like, how come no one is, like, commenting on this? Like, I'm noticing this, I'm a law enforcement officer, I'm a detective, I've done, worked crime scenes and homicides. Like, how is nobody commenting on all these things that, he just explained to Steve? He thought it was especially odd that no one had commented on it, especially after they had said that the first shot hadn't killed Scott. He was like, this is just very unusual and very weird that no one is commenting on this. Chief Murray also thought the positioning of Scott's arms were also questionable and unusual. So the crime scene photos show Scott's right arm tucked right against the side of his body, with his thumb in the rifle's trigger guard. Remember, we've commented on this before. Now, when Murray saw this, the first word that came to his mind, the very first thing, was staged. Murray contended that if Scott had indeed shot himself a second time, his thumb would not have remained in the trigger guard. He said the recoil from the shot would have caused Scott's arm to, like, flail away, and there was no way his thumb would still be, like, in the trigger guard. He just thought it was very convenient that there was no, like, involuntary motion or jerking from Scott even after he had, like, shot himself. You know what I mean? Like, when you shoot a body, there's, like, sometimes there's jerking and stuff like that from the body, and Murray was just like, well, that's kind of convenient that, like, he shot himself the second time and it, like, was so, like, clean and stuff that his arm was, like, tucked right by the side of his body with the thumb in the trigger guard. He thought that was just very odd. This whole positioning and all that just seemed like too perfect for Chief Murray, That's why it was very suspicious. It was almost even amateurish. Almost as if, like, you were gonna set up a scene for a movie and you were gonna get, like, that nice shot or whatever. He said that's what it reminded him of. It's almost as if someone, like, staged this to, film a movie or do a photo shoot or something. And yeah, it was basically saying, like, yeah, there's no way that Scott's hand and thumb would land in, like, this perfect, like, way after he shot himself. The recoil or an involuntary jerk or motion from his body would have made it, more, like, random, you know what I mean? It was just too perfect to Chief Murray. He thought it was odd that the rifle was leaning up against Scott's side of his body, the right side, up over his chest and pointed towards his mouth. Again, I believe it was Stacy kind of mentioned that's what she thought she saw, the gun laying kind of like across Scott, pointing towards his mouth. And Murray was just like, really? Like, that's how this landed? There was no recoil, no involuntary jerk, like nothing that would make the rifle sort of land in a more explainable / real position. And Murray just told Steve, quote, it simply doesn't look right. Chief Murray also took a really hard look at the murder weapon itself. And it was a Marlin Firearms Company, which is a subsidiary of Remington Arms, Glenfield model 75C 22 long rifle caliber semi-automatic rifle. That is a mouthful. So the gun, the murder weapon, can hold 15 22 long rifle cartridges. And according to the tests that Chief Murray and his team conducted, it takes about 5.5 pounds of pressure / force to pull the trigger. And because it, takes, 5 pounds to pull the trigger, Murray wondered if Scott would even be, like, physically capable or strong enough to shoot himself a second time after that first shot. So the overall length of the gun is 36.5 inches with a muzzle to trigger distance of 23 inches. And so Murray then re-examined all of the investigators' notes and reports. So according to Detective Jon Stout and his team, Scott shot himself the first time in the back of his head behind his left ear. Remember, we've discussed that. But this was not a contact wound. Scott had no powder burns or singed hair where the bullet entered his head. Therefore, the shot had to have come from a rifle that was about 8 to 12 inches away from Scott's head when it was fired. And as Chief Murray was explaining this to Steve, he got out a yardstick and he, held it up to the back of his head, and he held it up, behind his left ear, and he was trying to, mimic the angle and like the positioning Scott would have to have in order to shoot himself in this way. But Chief Murray said him and his whole team, like none of them could recreate this scenario. And, you know, Chief Murray told Steve that, like, me and my whole team, we don't think Scott did this at all. And, like, that's pretty compelling, right? Like, it's one thing when you have rumors, people online or whatever saying, you know, all this stuff, but like, what do you do, right? When like a certified law enforcement officer, someone who is qualified, has decades of experience, comes and tells you like, hey, I think there's something, you know, fishy here. I mean, that would certainly make you stop and question, right? Even if you had never questioned the investigation to begin with, that would certainly kind of make you stop and pause, wouldn't it? I know, like, I would. I'd be like, wait a minute. This dude thinks that, you know, something's fishy here or whatever. Like, yeah, that would definitely cause me to quirk an eyebrow, you know? But that wasn't all. There was even more. So Murray and all of his deputies concurred that Scott would have had to have held the barrel of the gun with his right hand away from his head, and then pulled the trigger with his left hand in like this awkward way in order to shoot himself behind the ear and have it not be a contact wound. But Scott, who by the way was right-handed, had no burn marks on his right hand at all. Because, you know, if you hold the barrel of a gun, like they get hot, right? He would have had some sort of like burn marks or something on his right hand. There was nothing like that. And, you know, to Chief Murray and his deputies, they were like, that is the only way that Scott could have done this in the way that lines up with the investigator reports and the autopsy reports. And it just doesn't make any sense. Murray also pointed out in the reports that I guess the last cartridge of the rifle had not fully ejected. And Murray was telling Steve, like, yeah, like the shooter had used this rifle about, you know, 10 times or more without any problem, without the cartridge getting stuck or anything like that. But why wouldn't this very last shot, the second shot that killed Scott, why would that not fully eject? He was pointing out, you know, like the killer had used this, you know, with no failure or anything. Why was this last shot, this cartridge wasn't fully ejected? Murray theorized that someone else had placed a hand over the port, causing the cartridge not to fully eject. And again, Murray told Steve that him and his whole team were not convinced that Scott was the shooter. There were other things that were odd to Murray and his team as well, as he explained to Steve. So not only did they look at the rifle that was used in the killings, right? They specifically looked at like the murder weapon, right? The actual weapon, and they traced that bad boy to its origins. So straight from the manufacturer, Merlin, the gun had been sold to Gilbert Sporting Goods in Cincinnati in 1976. The store, which had gone out of business sometime in the 1980s, had sold the rifle in 1977 to a customer. That customer was 19-year-old Kevin Miller, who lived in Bell Fountain. Now, Kevin did not have the weapon at the time of the killings. He told detectives that he had sold it to someone, he couldn't remember who, someone in the 1980s. He thought the person may have lived on the west side of Bell Fountain, but that's really all he could remember about who had bought his gun. And I'm not sure if Murray and his team like lose track of the weapon after that, or if that person Kevin sold it to was Gary Schaefer. But either way, the weapon was identified as being his. That's what the Logan County Sheriff's Office was saying, is that like, yeah, the rifle used in the killings was Gary's. However, Ron Schaefer, Gary's brother, remember he was like super overcome with emotion at his brother's funeral? He said that he knew every weapon that his brother had. And he was adamant that his brother did not own a .22 rifle. He said he knew exactly what rifles and handguns his brother owned, and a .22 rifle was not one of them. He said that his brother really only owned a few guns as it was, and even if he did own a .22 rifle, he would have never bought a used one. So apparently, all right, this little tidbit, this little information about the murder weapon's origin somehow found its way to the public. And so, of course, you know, this case was already, you know, the talk of the town, the small communities. This, of course, just exacerbated that, and everyone began talking about the murder weapon and like, oh, where did it come from? You know, where do you think it come from? And all that other stuff. And everyone was wondering like, what happened to this rifle after Kevin sold it in the 1980s? Now, there were some rumors circulating around town about where the rifle could have possibly ended up, and there were some who speculated that Detective Stout's family's gun shop may have sold the weapon. So the Stout family gun shop, it was now out of business, had a pretty heavy reputation of buying and selling weapons without maintaining the proper paperwork. There were also additional rumors that weapons at the Logan County Sheriff's Office evidence room lockup had a habit of somehow disappearing, and later on, those same weapons that had disappeared would coincidentally end up being sold by the Stout family gun shop. So yeah, that was definitely one rumor going around, is that, yeah, somehow the Stouts got their hands on the rifle and I guess had sold it to Gary? Or maybe had, sold it to someone else. Again, the shop had a reputation of doing a lot of things under the table, so I'm sure they didn't always ask for proper ID and stuff like that. But that was just one of the many, many rumors that floated around town after this little tidbit about, the murder weapon's origins leaked. So as Chief Murray and Steve are still going over, they started, talking, and Steve started discussing with Murray, about other things that, kind of made them question what the Logan County Sheriff's Office had concluded, So one of the things that had them sort of scratching their head was the fact that Scott was found. He was found with socks on. All right, remember, he was just in jeans and socks is what he was found in. However, the socks he was found in were pristine white, super clean and super white. And so you're probably, your assumption would be oh, well, obviously he must have taken his shoes off before he killed himself, right? But why would he take his shoes off? That was the question they had. And if he had walked around the house killing people in his socks, how had they stayed so clean? The floors at Kay's home were pretty dusty and dirty, as, normal people's hardwood floors are. They're hard to maintain. So that was something that was kind of odd to them. Something that was kind of odd to Steve was the jeans that Scott was found wearing. So Steve pointed out that the jeans that Scott had been wearing in the crime scene photos didn't have a belt through them. And this had immediately struck Steve as odd. It was one of the questions he had always had nagging in the back of his mind. And the reason this was sort of odd to Steve and why he noticed it is that he knew his son had a pretty thin, wiry frame. And as such, he had to have a belt. He had a very thin, wiry frame, so even the skinniest jeans that he could get, he still needed a belt, otherwise they would just fall off. And, Steve thought that was odd. Another thing that was kind of, odd/interesting was in the crime scene photos, on the floor of Scott's bedroom, there was a bunch of clothes, all right? It was super messy. But among the clothes on the floor was a pair of jeans that did have a belt through them. The belt was still on. How sometimes you just undo your jeans and just kind of take them off and the belt is still through them? That's how, these jeans were. And so, then the question was okay, so, did Scott change jeans before he killed himself? Why? And why would he put a belt on? Why do any of this, really? And you're probably thinking oh, did the jeans with the belt on them on the floor, they must have had blood on them because, maybe he committed the murder in those jeans. But no blood was found on those jeans. So, again, that really made Steve question, because he's wait a minute, I know Scott. I know he has to have a belt through his jeans or they're gonna slip off. If he, went to his grandparents' house, walked across the field or along the highway or whatever, he would have put a belt on, you know what I mean? He wouldn't have been able to walk all that way without a belt on, Chief Murray also brought up to Steve something else that nagged him about everything, which was the temperature. The temperature that it was when the murders happened and when the crime scene was being scoured. So the morning of the killings, the temperature stayed about the mid-40s. And every other victim who was found was wearing some sort of warm clothes, right? Long sleeves, long pants, right? But why did Scott not have any warm clothes on? He was the only one. And if he had switched clothes, so if he hadn't committed the massacre in nothing but jeans and his socks or whatever, where was his bloody clothes then that he switched out of? There were no other bloody clothes that were found. And there was also a pair of really thickly caked on muddy boots found in Scott's room. And I think that was another thing that kind of tied to the clean white socks, is that they're wait a minute, if he had his boots on doing the massacre, because remember his socks were super, clean and stuff, how did he not track mud all throughout the house? house. These work boots are pretty bad. And I don't think they found another pair of like bloody socks or something. So again, that was why the pristine white socks stood out to Murray. Murray also pointed to those blood streaks, like those blood splatters that were at the head of Scott's bed. I remember it was on the wall next to where Paige laid. Because the Logan County Sheriff's Office never tested the blood, we don't know whose it is. Is it Scott's? Is it Paige's? Could it be someone else's? We don't know. Because, yeah, the sheriff's office did not bother testing that blood, even though they recorded it as belonging to Paige. Now, to Murray, this made no sense at all. Not just, classifying that it was someone's blood without testing it, but based on the, position of Paige and how she was shot, Murray was like, wait, so was Paige shot when she was sitting up in bed or something? Because that's the only way that makes sense to me. And if she had been shot sitting up in bed, why had the detectives found her laying down facing the wall with, the blanket tucked underneath her chin, right? I thought that was super weird too. Like that all the victims were found with their blanket tucked up to their chin and almost like they were snuggled in bed or something. Yeah, I always thought that was super weird. And Murray also pointed out that the shot that had killed Paige, she was shot behind her left ear, execution style. And from the placement, Murray contended that the shot did come as she was sleeping. But that means that, she wasn't shot, sat up in bed, and that blood on the wall couldn't have been hers. And if it wasn't Paige's blood, Murray was like, well, it could only be Scott's blood then. Which, according to Murray, if that was Scott's blood right there at the top of the bed, that changed the whole scenario. So Murray pointed to Andrew Denny's statement and then asked Steve, quote, Andrew Denny says that when he left the house that morning, there was a male sleeping on the sofa. Brett Davidson stated he slept on the sofa that night, but when he left the house that morning, saying goodbye to Sherry Kay, he clearly remembered seeing a big Dodge truck with distinctive smokestacks parked in the driveway. That truck belonged to Denny. Davidson said he looked at his cell phone to see the time when he woke up and that he left the house around 6 that morning. Andrew Denny said he left the house around 7. If Davidson wasn't sleeping on the sofa, who was lying there? Did Denny see someone else? I personally think Andrew was just mistaken. Personally, early in the morning, dude is running late from work, not really paying attention. It's still somewhat dark out, I believe. I think he just kind of saw something maybe out of the corner of his eye, like the peripheral. He knew Brett and Megan were down there. So I personally don't really put a lot of stock in what Andrew said right there. I think he was mistaken. He didn't even really know what time he had left the home. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think he thought he saw Brett there, but he wasn't. Brett was gone by that time. That's personally what I think about that little tidbit about Andrew seeing someone on the couch. Several reports also stated, we talked about this as well, that deputies found Gary and Cheryl's house locked up all tight, right? Remember, they had to break into the house to gain entry. And as we know, other witnesses and reports stated that Gary and Cheryl were pretty religious about locking their doors and keeping their house locked up. And so the question that Murray had was how did the shooter get in and out of Gary and Cheryl's house with locking it up, because, again, the police had to break into the house. Therefore, when the killer left Gary and Cheryl's, they must have locked it up. And then, of course, also begs the question, how did the shooter get in to begin with, And I think that's why some people actually kind of points to this little fact that, oh, well, obviously this was Scott. Stacy said Scott had a key to his grandma and grandpa's house, and he knew their routine and stuff. But even that didn't really satisfy, Chief Murray. He then just questioned, quote, what could have set Scott off? He apparently was sleeping when Davidson and Denny left. Why would he wake up suddenly and go on a shooting rampage? Everybody else was sleeping, so others in the house couldn't have set him off. And why would he go over to his grandparents' house first? Scott would have had to wake up, get dressed, walk over to his grandparents' house where they let him in, go into the basement to fetch the .22 rifle, shoot both of his grandparents while they were standing in their kitchen preparing breakfast, unusual headshots behind the ears, lock their dog in one of the bedrooms at some point, return to his own home a quarter of a mile away, take off his sweatshirt, shirt, belt, or change jeans, and shoes, and then shoot everybody else. And this all just didn't sound right to Murphy. He was like, okay, even if you say that this points to Scott being the shooter, the fact that Gary and Cheryl's house was locked up, it still doesn't explain the motive. And the way Chief Murray lays it out, it's pretty compelling, right? It's nobody could have set him off, so this couldn't have been some sort of crime of passion thing or something, you know what I mean? And then when you lay out the scenario, the way Chief Murray did about, he had to wake up, get dressed, go to his grandparents, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, it does kind of make you scratch your head and you're just like, is that really what happened? And yeah, real quick, just because he mentioned it in his, in his quote there. Yeah, the Schaefers apparently had a dog that when the police were, combing their house and combing the crime scene, they found their dog had been locked in one of the back rooms. And yeah, all of this, it just didn't sound right to Chief Murray. And then when you point to the fact that all of Scott's friends and family say that, like, he wasn't that big of a fan of guns, he wasn't like some avid shooter or marksman or anything, it just raised more questions for Chief Murray, and he was like, these shots to me look like professional hits. And you can certainly see why someone could come to that conclusion, right? Like, all the shots were very methodical. Right? That was another thing that, people were questioning is that, like, yeah, Gary and Cheryl especially, they were up moving around, their kitchen, and boom, boom, they were just put down so methodically that that's why people were like, but Scott wasn't a shooter. He wasn't a marksman. He wasn't even that great of a shot. How could this kid, went and, so methodically shot all these people in such a precise way? And apparently it really was the shots behind the ear that really raised a lot of eyebrows. And apparently, remember we mentioned this in last week's video, it's like the most efficient way to kill someone. Efficient in the sense that it instantly kills them, I guess. I'm not sure. But yeah, it was very, very weird. And they were like, this is not common knowledge either. You know what I mean? Apparently, to shoot someone behind the ear is the way to kill them with a gun. That's something, someone who target shoots or knows about, snipers and assassins and that kind of thing, you know what I mean? It's an execution style shot, apparently. I just thought all that was really interesting. That was just, I didn't get that information just from the book. There were a few newspaper articles that were talking about it. I wonder why behind the ear is so effective. So yeah, the placement of these shots and just how, precisely everyone was killed just really didn't sit right with a lot of people, including Chief Murray. Gary and Cheryl especially looked wrong to Chief Murray because, again, they were up and standing and they were like, dude, not a single shot in the body. The shots that Gary and Cheryl received were, efficient and methodical. How the hell would this 18-year-old kid who's only gone and shot rabbits a few times, be able to be such a good shot, So those were just some of the crucial things that Chief Murray wanted to bring to Steve Moody's attention. This is hey man, this is what I think, this is why, these are all the tests we conducted, this is all the research we've done, and yeah, these are just some questions that we have. So as, Chief Murray and Steve kind of pondered their questions and we're going over that, the coroner, remember Dr. Michael Failer, we talked about him in the last video, he was kind of experiencing some hostilities from the Logan County Sheriff's Office. Yeah, really interesting what we're about to get into. So apparently it was actually Dr. Failer's assistant who had worked the crime scene, and in securing the paperwork and finalizing Scott's autopsy, Dr. Failer had called up the sheriff's office, requesting additional information that he needed for his reports. So Dr. Failer either wanted to re-interview certain witnesses, such as the counselor, remember Cheryl Garland Briggs, who said that Kay had come into her counseling center to, talk about Scott being abusive or whatever. Dr. Failer wanted to talk to Cheryl, or at least listen to the interview tapes with her or other witnesses, such as when the detectives interviewed Amanda Arthur, remember Scott's ex-girlfriend. So yeah, Dr. Failer had pretty much called up the Logan County Sheriff's Office and was like, hey, can I either, re-interview these people, or can you at least give me your notes or tapes of their interviews, because want to get everything squared away on my end, right? Dr. Failer was especially interested in Cheryl and Amanda's interviews and what they had to say and their information, because it added to the suicide theory. Dr. Failer was well aware of all the rumors flying around town. He was well aware that people were not believing that Scott had done this. So Dr. Failer wanted to just dot all of his I's, cross all of his T's, because he thought if he could put together a comprehensive, concrete, solid, report and all that of his findings and all that stuff, it could, make people realize that oh, Scott really did do this. We need to get over it. You know what I mean? He was well aware of the rumors going on about how incompetent and corrupt the Logan County Sheriff's Office detectives and investigators were. And so, yeah, Dr. Failer was like, you know what? If I can independently interview these witnesses or, independently verify what the sheriff's office interviewed them for, then yeah, maybe we can get people to accept what really happened. That was really what Dr. Failer was trying to do. But the Logan County Sheriff's Office was not very appreciative of Dr. Failer's efforts, all right? They were not too thrilled. So there was actually a recorded conversation between Dr. Failer and Detective Sergeant Jeff Cooper, who, if you remember, is head of the department's detectives. And in this recorded phone call, Sergeant Cooper makes a lot of wild leaps of logic and assumptions. He accused Dr. Failer of working against the police. At one time, he even told the doctor, quote, "What the situation is, doctor, the thing that's coming to my mind is you're not believing what we're telling you. The way I'm taking it is, what you're saying is, I want to listen to this lady because I don't believe you talked to her." And this was in regards to Failer wanting to interview Cheryl. And Sergeant Cooper was apparently very offended at this request. Quote, "Because every time we go talk to somebody and tell you what has happened, well, you want to interview them." Sergeant Cooper would not listen to anything that Dr. Failer was saying at all, just wouldn't listen. He didn't care about people's perception of the investigation either. Quote, "I'm just telling you my opinion. In my opinion, that is what I'm getting out of this. You don't believe what we tell you, and you're the first coroner that's ever had questions about what we tell you as far as the information that we have. Why do you need to go and get it yourself?" And he just wouldn't let up. Even after, Dr. Failer was trying to assure him, bro, I'm not trying to do anything at all. I'm not trying to work against you. I'm not trying to make you guys look bad at all. And just trying to get Sergeant Cooper to realize that, bro, you're completely misinterpreting, what I'm doing here. But Sergeant Cooper just said, quote, I may be totally off the mark here, but that's the way I'm thinking. I'm taking it that you're thinking we're incompetent, that you don't believe the information we're giving you, and you're going out and doing your own separate investigation. For instance, you bring in the picture of the older gray-haired EMT member that was working on Stacy, wanting to know his name. And he again went off on Dr. Failer for daring to want to interview or listen to the interviews of crucial witnesses. And I guess, yeah, he was just being a total petulant child throughout the whole thing. And at one point, he whined to Dr. Failer, quote, "Then why do we even do it? We'll just let you do it." And this was in reference to, again, Dr. Failer just wanting to independently verify everything that the sheriff's office had concluded. He even accused Dr. Failer of calling him a liar. And eventually, Sergeant Cooper, the petulant child that he had been throughout the whole conversation, just hung up on Dr. Failer. Yeah, isn't that weird? Talk about a weird overreaction. That's one of those things where it's bro, the way you're acting right now and the things you're saying says a lot more about you than anything else, right? Kind of weird for Sergeant Cooper to be all up on Dr. Failer's shit like this. This is a huge case and a huge deal in the area. You've got people questioning the authorities' investigation and their conclusions. Why wouldn't you want someone else to independently verify that? You know what I mean? I would, if I was the Logan County Sheriff's Office, I would absolutely be you know what? Yeah, go ahead. Take everything we have and verify it. And, we'll show you guys that Scott did this and we've come to the right conclusions. But it's just so weird that they pushed back so hard against Dr. Failer. Very weird. But this wouldn't be the end of the strange behavior that was exhibited by the Logan County Sheriff's Office, all right? Again, a lot of talk of corruption and incompetence within the sheriff's office. So, local pizza shop owner Robbie Richards owned Vicario's Pizza. I hope I said that right. And he often had Belle Fountain and Logan County Sheriff's Office deputies and police officers in his shop all the time. Now, right after the murders, Robbie, who had a reputation of doing all kinds of local community events and fundraisers and stuff, decided to host a fundraiser for Stacy. And he sponsored it as well, not just hosted it, he sponsored it as well. So it was to help the Moody family with their medical and legal expenses. So in the weeks/days leading up to the fundraiser, and pretty much right after he announced he was doing this fundraiser, the Logan County officers and deputies who frequented Robbie's shop ended up dropping subtle hints that maybe Robbie should rethink this fundraiser. And Robbie completely ignored this. Like many in the town, Robbie thought the whole investigation was sloppy, and he was one of the ones who did not believe that Scott was the shooter. And, seeing that, that it's his shop, he was not shy in his opinions of this, And he didn't care if Bell Fountain or Logan County police officers were in his shop. Like, he would let his opinion be known. But the fundraiser/event for the Moody family ended up going off without a hitch. So it was a poker run where participants would ride motorcycles to about 5 to 7 different locations. And at each of these locations /checkpoints, they would draw at random one card. And the objective was to have the best hand by the end of the run. It was completely, by chance that you would win, And the event did end up raising money for the Moody family. Now, surprisingly, all right, so there were 2 winners. I guess it was like a 50-50 like jackpot or whatever. Detective Jon Stout was one of the ones who won half of that jackpot. But instead of giving the money, the winnings, to the Moodys as a donation, as everyone else was planning, Detective Stout decided to keep all of the money, and he said that he was going to give it to his wife. Afterwards, I guess Stacy sort of shamed him a little bit, and he ended up giving her $100 and told her, quote, "See, I'm a good cop." Yeah. But after this fundraising event, Robbie was then harassed by the local police, specifically the Logan County Sheriff's Office. It escalated to the point that Robbie was super paranoid and nervous all the time. So in early November of 2005, one of the sheriff's detectives, Frenchie Robinson, followed Robbie as he left work and drove to a local club/bar to hang out. Now, after Robbie had been at this club/bar for a couple hours, he looked out the window and he was startled to see Detective Robinson still there watching the club. Now, at this point, Robbie was freaking out. So he decided to call a friend on a cell phone and just told her kind of how scared he was right now. He told her the situation, how he believed it had something to do with him doing that event for the Moodys, how he didn't think Scott had really done it, and that he was legitimately afraid he was going to be killed for knowing too much or, opening his mouth. He actually cried on this phone call to his friend. He was so scared, and he asked her, begged her to take care of his children should anything happen to him. That's how freaked out Robbie was. After he hung up with his friend, Robbie then decided to call the sheriff's office. He demanded to speak to the detective supervisor, which, as we know, was Sergeant Cooper. Robbie demanded that they leave him alone. He said to call off Detective Robinson, and surprisingly, it worked. After Robbie got off the phone, Detective Robinson left. Now, the next morning, Robbie drove over to Dayton to secure legal representation, just in case. He didn't know if maybe the cops were going to try some, hinky shit to try to get him, thrown behind bars or maybe trumped up on charges, or maybe he would end up dead. He didn't know, but he wanted to go get his affairs in order and secure legal representation. Yeah, that is creepy. Another thing that is super interesting about this is only a couple weeks later, Detective Robinson tendered his resignation. And supposedly it had to do with some involvement to do with drugs. But of course, it's a small community and rumors swirled. And they were saying that this resignation was really just a smokescreen. And the rumor was that the seniors, the higher ups in the Logan County Sheriff's Office, was afraid that Detective Robinson had loose lips and might talk about things that he otherwise shouldn't. And that is the real reason he resigned. That was what the local rumors were all about. So yeah, not sure what we're supposed to take from that, but take from that what you will. And if you thought this behavior by the police is kind of creepy, prepare yourself for what we're about to get into, all right? We're going to talk about some nasty, predatory, sexual assault stuff. And it's gross. So as all of this is going on, all right, Steve starting to question the investigation and the stuff going on with Robbie and whatnot. As all of this was going on, Detective Stout continued to work the case, even though Sheriff Henry had officially closed it, but whatever. Detective Stout continued to work the case, and he was convinced that Stacy was not telling everything that she knew. So I don't know if that's why he was still working the case or what. Now, Steve and Audrey were concerned as well, obviously. We said this at the beginning, right? Not only did they have Stacy Stacy's own pain and trauma to deal with. They had their own stuff going on, including the 2 legal battles, the 2 wrongful death lawsuits that the estates of Paige and Megan had brought forth. Now, even though, the suit was against Scott's estate, remember, Steve was the executor of Scott's estate, so this was his problem to deal with. And this is on top of them trying to work and, raise their 3 sons on top of all that, all right? So yeah, things are not easy for Steve and Audrey. So when Detective Stout came to Steve and Audrey and offered to buddy up to Stacy, they absolutely jumped at this opportunity. It's almost as if predators specifically seek out their victims. Stout told the Moodys that he was pretty sure that he could break through to Stacy and get her to reveal what she was, really holding back. And yeah, with everything the Moodys were dealing with right here, they thought this was like a gift from God. They were like, oh my God, this is like heaven sent. We can get this law enforcement professional, this detective, to deal with Stacy while we handle everything else, fantastic. Detective Stout had a long career in Logan County as a top-tier detective. We've said this ad nauseum. It's a small, tight-knit community. And so it didn't even enter Steve and Audrey's mind that Detective Stout would have ulterior motives and that this move on Detective Stout's part was a cold and calculated one. So Stout arranged to pick up Stacy for lunch on Wednesday, August 17th. 2005. He arrived at the Moody home around noon in his unmarked police cruiser, and he was on duty. He suggested taking Stacy to Indian Lake, which was about a 10-minute drive, and, to go buy her, fast foods from somewhere. He picked Stacy up, and the 35-year-old police detective left with the 15-year-old traumatized teenager. And instead of fast food, they went to Red Lobster, that same Red Lobster that Kay and Jason had gone to in Lima, which again was about a 30-minute drive. Now, it is said Stacy apparently wanted a nice lunch. So Stout drove her, to Lima to have lunch at the Red Lobster. Now, Stout radioed the dispatcher and lied, saying he had a case to follow up on in Lima, so he was going to head over there and he was going to be out of the office for a while. Stacy would later tell her parents that Stout paid for the meal with a credit card and that she, quote, had gotten into Stout's wallet pretty good. Now, after eating lunch at Red Lobster, Stout then took Stacy driving around Lima and the surrounding area to all of the rough neighborhoods with known, drug dealers, gang affiliations and stuff like that, showing her that he knew where all the drug dealers' house were and he knew where all the criminals hung out and stuff, kind of showing off to her a little bit. He boasted to her that he knew where all the crooks lived. After more than 3 hours, Stout took Stacy home. Now, according to Stacy, nothing untoward or fishy happened, and, she actually enjoyed herself. Now, Stout's version of that day differed a little bit. Now get this. Stout told others that Stacy was staring at him with, quote, love eyes. Ugh. And he said that after he asked her several times what was on her mind, Stacy told him that she loved, quote, giving head, aka, oral sex. And Stout took that to mean that she wanted to perform oral sex on him. Now, when later questioned about this incident by a social worker, Stacy was like, wait, what? No. Let me tell you, what actually happened. She said that Stout had repeatedly, kept asking her question after question. What'd she like to do? What'd she like to do in sports? And blah, 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 blah. And finally, getting sick and tired of his pestering questions, Stacy had answered him very, sarcastically that she liked, quote, giving head. She was just kind of being a smart ass when she said that. And she said after this, Stout sort of, smiled and showed, a pleasant surprise. And she immediately regretted saying this. She thought it was completely inappropriate, and she immediately regretted it. Yeah, are you grossed out? Do you feel dirty yet? It gets so much worse. So several weeks later, on September 7th, Detective Stout and Brugler stopped by the Moody home, and Stout asked Stacy if she wanted to have lunch with him again. Stacy would later say at this point in time, when Stout asked her this, she felt kind of intimidated by him. Intimidated and impressed, with this adult detective. And she just kind of smiled awkwardly and didn't really answer, Stout's question. And then only a few days later, Stout drove to Stacy's high school around 12:30 p.m. when she was on her lunch and again asked if she wanted to go get lunch with him. And she agreed. They went to McDonald's and then they drove out to Indian Lake. Now, after they parked, Stacy noticed that there was another man parked in a car in the area, and Stout made some creepy comment that involved about like, oh, we must have interrupted what that guy was doing or something like that, you know, totally appropriate comment to say with a 15-year-old who has just been, victimized and traumatized. And it was after he made this comment that Stacy noticed a pair of handcuffs. They were down by the seat buckle, and Stout noticed her noticing them, and he asked her if she liked them and to give them over to him. He took them from her, reached over, grabbed her arm, then handcuffed Stacy's left hand to his steering wheel. Or technically her left wrist, technically. Yeah, completely unprompted or anything, just out of nowhere. Can you imagine, like, this officer just out of nowhere handcuffing you to a steering wheel? Stacy said that they hurt and to please take them off, which he did. And then he asked Stacy if she wanted to drive his cruiser around. Now, Stacy said initially she didn't really want to, she didn't even have her learner's permit yet, I mean, she was still kind of recovering from her injury, so, she didn't really want to, but after a lot of badgering and, pressure from Stout, she finally agreed. And when she put a hand on a wheel, Stout insisted that she slide over and sit on his lap. Yeah, so fucking disgusting. So Stacy, slid over, sat on his lap, and began steering the car. They drove around the parking lot some before she pulled out onto the highway. Stacy would later remark that she could feel Stout's erection the whole time that she was sitting on his lap and driving. Yeah. Ugh, isn't that so gross? Now, after they pulled over and she, got off his lap and she was done driving the cruiser, the two started talking and they ended up engaged in, some flirty, sexual banter. Finally, Stacy asked Stout, well, what would your wife think if she knew, what we were saying and, doing right now? And Stout just replied, quote, "It's simple. My wife would never know." He then teased Stacy, quote, "I've got naked pictures of you from the hospital, and I'm keeping them in my desk drawer. Because you're so hot, I sometimes show them to other detectives." This is a working detective, a 35, 36-year-old man, saying this to a 15-year-old teenager, guys. We actually can believe it. We can, right? Unfortunately. Now, Stacy became very angry and upset at this, I guess it was supposed to be flirting on Stout's part? I don't know, but she became very upset about this. I would be upset, wait a minute, what do you mean you have naked pictures of me and you're, showing them around? What the hell? And Stout finally told her, oh, no, I'm just kidding. I don't have any naked pictures of you, I promise. I was just kidding. What a creepo, weirdo freak. The conversation continued after that, pretty much along these same lines, flirty sexual banter. Stout said some very gross things to this teenager, which included him saying that he wanted to, quote, "see those pretty things," referring to Stacy's breasts. At first, Stacy said no, but she would later say that Stout kept pressing her, as these predator freaks do, right? And after a while, Stacy said she began enjoying the attention that she was getting. Remember, she had had a really rough year. This was mere months after the massacre. And she was already struggling with, because, she never really knew what people really thought of her, and she kind of appreciated that Stout was just sort of being blunt and honest with her and telling her how it is. You know what I mean? Again, there's a reason why these fucking freaks go after, teenagers, specifically vulnerable teenagers who are already in a vulnerable situation in life, right? Stacy then showed Stout her bra, and then he reached over and groped her for a moment, saying, quote, "Oh yeah, these are nice." Ugh. He then slipped his hands inside of her bra and cupped her breast and groped her. And before anything further could happen, Stout's cell phone rang. It was Audrey saying that he needed to bring Stacy home right away because her tutor had showed up. Stacy said Stout, quote, "raced her home and dropped her off." Another meeting would take place between the two on September 13th. Stout had called the Moodys and told them that he had planned to pick Stacy up from school again and take her to lunch. He told them that he was really, connecting with her and that, maybe she would open up more. And Steve and Audrey happily agreed. They were so impressed and so thankful that they had this, this law enforcement officer who was taking such a special interest in their daughter who was really struggling. Yeah, are you frustrated and disgusted? I was livid when I was reading this. And so, as planned, Stout picked her up on the 13th. And when she got in his unmarked vehicle, he had a surprise birthday card for her. Stacy had turned 16. Inside, Stout had written, to this teenager, quote, "Happy birthday, 16. Have a wonderful birthday. You deserve it. You're an incredible person, and you will be in a special spot in my heart. Friends forever." Yeah. Fucking gross. So gross, so disgusting, so egregious, like, oh my god. After giving her this card, Stout said that he planned on taking Stacy to the general's office in Dayton. Now, Stacy had no idea what the hell Stout was talking about, what he meant by this, but she knew she had a tutoring session later that afternoon and was like, yeah, no, I can't be gone all afternoon. Like, I have, school and tutoring and stuff. And coincidentally, right after Stacy told Stout this, he got a mysterious phone call on his cell phone that said, oh, you know what? That meeting had changed to the sheriff's office here in Logan County, so Stout would be able to take Stacy to lunch after all. So they ended up going to Burger King and again driving to Indian Lake. They watched boaters on the lake, all while Stout made very crude, rude comments on women's bodies. He looked at one and told Stacy, quote, "Look at her, she's really fat. She has one boob in front of the boat and another boob in the back of the boat." And then Stout reached over, grabbed his handcuffs, without asking Stacy, grabbed her left wrist and once again handcuffed her to his steering wheel. He then took her right hand, or specifically her right wrist, and attached it to her seatbelt latch. So she sit there with her hands cuffed on the steering wheel and her seatbelt latch. Yeah, just out of nowhere, he did this. How creepy. Stacy said she kind of just like smiled nervously and kind of, like she didn't really know what to do. And that's when Stout then leaned over and put his head on her shoulder and began groping her over her shirt. Stacy told him that she was scared to be handcuffed and, what if somebody saw them? But Stout just told her, quote, "I've never done this before. I won't go any further than you want me to." We know exactly what's happening here, right? It's grooming. This is exactly what predators and what pedo freaks like Stout do, right? And, Stacy began, relaxing a little bit to his touch and, becoming less and less nervous. And, she was starting to believe like, oh, well, maybe this is okay after all. Maybe it's not really that big of a deal. She finally asked Stout to uncuff her, which he did so, reluctantly. They joked around some more before Stout then asked Stacy to climb onto his lap, facing him. And once Stacy did, Stout kissed her. And Stacy just said, quote, "Dude, you have a wife." To which he just replied, quote, "She'll never find out." And that is when they started making out. And, as, the seconds and minutes passed by, Stacy was, again, becoming more comfortable, relaxing to his touch, maybe even enjoying herself a little bit and enjoying the attention. After another car pulled into the area, that is when Stout took Stacy back to school. Now, after this, and with Steve and Audrey none the wiser, completely in the dark of what was going on, they allowed Stacy and Stout to communicate on the phone. Stout assured the Moodys that he was making headway with Stacy. Yeah, are you outraged and disgusted yet? In one phone call, Stacy expressed an interest in photography and police work. And then the next time they spoke after that, Stout suggested that Stacy go out on an overnight stakeout with him. He told Stacy and the Moodys that Detective Brugler, along with himself, would be along for the stakeout. And so, with everything seeming legit, Stout picked up Stacy on Friday night, September 30th, around 11 p.m. And to further ingratiate himself to the Moodys and Stacy, he brought with him some baby spoons that had belonged to Stacy and Scott. The sheriff's office had received them after an anonymous woman had purchased them. There was an auction held that sold off a bunch of the Schaefer's and Kay's stuff, and these baby spoons were one of them. And this anonymous woman took them to the sheriff's office, thinking that maybe Stacy would like to have them since, they belonged to her and her brother. Now, Stout told the Moodys that the stakeout was taking place at a tractor factory plant where it was rumored that tractors were being stolen during shift change, which was around midnight. He told them that he and Detective Brugler were the leads on the case and that they were going to go pick him up after he left their house. Yeah. So conveniently, he doesn't have Brugler with him when he stops by the Moody's house, but he tells them, oh, we're going to go pick him up after, don't worry. But of course, as we know, after Stout left with Stacy, they didn't go and pick up Detective Brugler. Stout then drove Stacy toward Bell Fountain, again showing her the rough areas and neighborhoods. Stacy would later say that Stout seemed super excited right now, super stoked, super jazzed. They also drove by Stout's home at one time, and around 11:30 p.m., he pulled into the Logan County Children's Services parking lot, and he told Stacy, quote, "Nobody ever looks around here." He then reclined his seat all the way back. Stacy told him to get his gun belt out of the way, to which he complied, and Stacy then crawled on Stout's lap. And once again, they began full-on making out. He bragged about his tattoos, but Stacy didn't believe that he had any, thinking that they wouldn't be permitted. And this is when Stout took the opportunity to conveniently take off his shirt where his tattoos were, and he told her, quote, "The large tattoo on my back almost caused my second divorce." They made out some more, and eventually, Stacy slid off her bra and pants and her underpants, and she then unbuttoned Stout's pants with her teeth, and that's when Stout told her, quote, "You don't have to do anything. Just climb up on my chest and sit on my face. I just want to give you a little lick." Ugh, so fucking disgusting. And after some coaxing, because he had to convince her, he convinced Stacy to do just this. Afterwards, the two then had sex in Stout's police vehicle. Now, when Stacy said that she was concerned about getting pregnant, Stout said not to worry. He was, quote, unhooked, aka had a vasectomy. Now, after they were done, Stacy drove the cruiser around some more, this time with Stout in the passenger seat. And finally, he took her home around 2 a.m. And Stacy told nobody what had happened at the stakeout, and she was hoping that nobody would question her on it. Now, the following week, Audrey called Stout to see if maybe he could come over and talk to Stacy. They felt that she was ready to open up, and they thought Stout had made great progress with her. I know. Can you imagine? Can you imagine, dude? Ugh, it's so disgusting. So Stout drove over, picked Stacy up, and they drove over to DeGraff, where he filled up his cruiser. They then drove down State Route 235, and then Stout pulled off onto a long, narrow dirt road that led to an abandoned farmhouse. He parked there, and then told Stacy, quote, "You know, I would lie to you if it would get you to sit on my lap." Stacy complied. And as she straddled him, Stout told her, quote, "We need to finally get this out in the open and bring some closure to the shooting. The sooner you agree that your brother was the shooter, the more we can sit here and play around. You need to stop the what-ifs." And that's when Stacy looked at Stout and told her that Scott was the shooter. And as soon as she said it, Stout reached over and the two would end up having sex yet again. But then one Monday afternoon in October, the phone rang at the Moody house and Stacy answered it. Now, for some reason, Audrey decided to gently lift the receiver and see who Stacy was talking to. And Audrey picked up just as Stout was explaining to Stacy that his wife was going to be out of town that weekend and that she should come over and spend the night. And Stacy was telling Stout that her parents would never allow that. And Stout interrupted her and told her to lie to her parents. Say that she was spending the night at a friend's house or something. And that is when Audrey quietly put down the phone. Can you imagine, picking up the phone and hearing that? It's just unreal. Not only do you have this, full-on adult taking advantage of this poor traumatized teenager, he is in, one of the ultimate forms of power and authority. A police officer, which is supposed to protect people. We all know that's not what they really do, but, it's besides the point, right? This ultimate position of power and authority. And not only does, he take advantage of, a teenager, to use that position in order to take advantage of that teenager and her family. It's disgusting. Now, Audrey, of course, immediately informed her husband, and both of the Moodys were flabbergasted and reeled from the fact that they were like, oh my God, the rumors about the Logan County Sheriff's Office are true. That they were corrupt sexual predators. Yeah. And we will dive a little bit more into these rumors, these sort of whisperings around the area that, the Logan County Sheriff's Office was just full of corrupt sexual pigs. So Audrey began making phone calls because she was like, where do I turn? Where do you go to report this kind of thing, right? And she received one tip that suggested she call the Ohio Attorney General's office, which was located in Columbus. And she was told this was the agency who had the necessary resources to take on Logan County. And that is exactly what the Moodys did. And on November 4th, 2005, Logan County Children's Services ended up filing a complaint with the Logan County Sheriff's Office against Detective Jon Stout based on allegations that he had sexual contact with a minor. On November 8th, Stout was placed on paid administrative leave. And initially, Sheriff Henry refused to even release Stout's name. Of course, because it's a good old boys club, right? Gotta protect your friends, gotta protect your buddies. He admitted that he hadn't read the report from the Logan County Children's Services, and he had decided to simply let the investigation take its course. Now, it is said Sheriff Henry knew that something like this was going to happen sooner or later. So remember when I said the Logan County Sheriff's Office long had rumors of being like corrupt sexual pigs? Well, apparently, in the department, the standing joke to rookie officers was, and I quote, "If you wanted to get a quick, satisfying blowjob, go troll the high school's parking lot for the young and dumb ones." Apparently, it was well known and established that the officers would go make accusations, usually involving drugs, saying that they knew about the teens partying, but in exchange for what they called a personal counseling session, these charges would magically disappear. Yeah, of course we can believe it. Of course we can believe it. Are you kidding me? And on November 29th, the Logan County Sheriff's Office conducted an administrative hearing, and it was in regards to the allegations against Stout. The hearing ended with the decision being that Stout had violated department policy regarding conduct and behavior and of dishonesty and insubordination as outlined by the Ohio Administrative Code. And this left Sheriff Henry with no other choice but to fire Detective Jon Stout from the Logan County Sheriff's Office. But Sheriff Henry was still an apologist. Get this. He said, quote, "Mr. Stout has many commendations in his personnel file, and he has worked doggedly on many cases. This is going to leave a big hole in the department. Jon solved a lot of cases. He was instrumental in a lot of cases, here and outside the county. He was instrumental in a lot of drug cases." Oh, was Johnny instrumental? Was he really, Henry? Really? Get the fuck out of here, you fucking pedo apologist pig. I'm sorry. There's no excuse. I don't give a fuck what Stout did in his career. I don't give a fuck. I don't care. He sexually assaulted a minor, a traumatized teenager who looked to him as some sort of, safety and authority. He was a fucking police officer, for crying out loud. Steve and Audrey trusted him. Nah. Fuck Stout, you pedo pig. Fuck him. And fuck Sheriff Henry for being an apologist for a pedo pig. Seriously, and then they wonder why we say ACAB, right? Now, after this, the state of Ohio then got involved, and the Ohio Attorney General's office then assigned Special Prosecutor Scott Longo. And he was an attorney with the Child and Elder Protection Section, and his job as the Special Prosecutor was to determine if Stout had done anything criminal. And if so, if it would be determined that Stout had indeed done something criminal, the case would then go before a Logan County grand jury who would decide if Stout should be indicted. Sandusky County Sheriff's Office Detective James Consolo was assigned as a special investigator to work with the Attorney General's office and Longo. And, his job was to, come in with an objective view and investigate these allegations and, investigate everything. Now, it is said the residents of Logan County at this point, when all this came out, just shook their heads in disgust. They were all fed up with the local law enforcement. Apparently, Stout was one of just many incidents that had come to light in 2005 that involved Logan County authorities. I guess another detective and a county dog warden had both tested positive for marijuana and had to be fired, and apparently that was a whole scandal. Stout's former partner, Larry Garwood, was found guilty of 3 misdemeanor charges for taking a fully automatic machine gun. Get this, he took a fully automatic machine gun from the evidence lockup, by the way, and ended up shooting up the camper trailers on a neighbor's property. I think he had some sort of dispute with this neighbor. And in the beginning of November of 2005, a county deputy working as a jailer lost his job because he was found to have abused his position. So just one of many, many incidents that had come to light around this time period. And when this whole thing with Stout came out, it is said the residents of Logan County, they just had it. They'd had it with these pigs. They'd had it with the corruption, with everything. They'd had it. They were disgusted. Rightfully so. Sheriff Henry just said, quote, "I'll be glad to see 2005 come to an end. It's been a rough year for us. Maybe because you hire pedo pig freaks who don't know how to do the job and all they know how to do is abuse their power. Maybe that's why it's been such a rough year for your department, Henry." However, Bell Fountain resident Elizabeth Miller had a more relevant statement to make about, the whole situation going on, specifically in regards to all the corruption. And it was published in the forum section of the Bell Fountain Examiner. And I just wanted to take a few minutes and read it to you because I thought it was just very, very apt. Act. Her letter read, quote, "While it is disturbing to learn that your tax dollars are being used to pay officers' wages who are supposed to be upholding the law, and now many are guilty of criminal activities, it is even more disturbing to realize that their criminal activities have been covered up and smoothed over by their superiors and co-workers. No ordinary individual would have been shown the leniency and clemency that these criminals who wear the badge that we are supposed to bow to have been shown by their superiors and the court system. Truly, this tells us there is a different code of judgment for them and the rest of society. I'm very certain that had I trespassed on another's property, shut up their campers with a machine gun, slashed their tires and stolen items from them, that I would have received more than a 15-day suspended jail sentence and a $500 fine. I also believe that the missteps made early in the investigation of this officer, Larry Garwood, who committed these crimes were deliberate, as was the reluctance of those in authority to act on the victim's complaints against Larry Garwood, forcing the victim to hire an attorney to defend his property and rights against this aggressor. Not only are these officers often protected by the legal system, but they are also allowed to resign and be awarded a job with another police department, again on taxpayers' money. I shudder to think that all those American soldiers in Iraq are dying for this kind of democracy. In addition to Mr. Garwood, 2 more who are drug users are allowed to resign by Sheriff Henry for so-called extenuating circumstances. Would that be so that they can continue to abuse our tax dollars by drawing a pension? They should have been hung out to dry like any ordinary citizen would have been in a private sector job. Sheriff Henry's statement that the instituted random drug testing a year ago when he could no longer look a person in the eye and say we have a drug-free workplace indicates they were using drugs all along. And wasn't the random drug testing actually a requirement of a new insurance policy that county employees were switched to? Now we have one of the elites charged with sexual contact with a teenage girl, dishonesty, and insubordination, and fired only after administrative hearings. Sheriff Henry's statement that the firing was not a decision he wanted to make sends the message that he would have preferred the actions of this employee, Stout, be swept under the rug also. If this employee was found guilty and charged with dishonesty, isn't it possible that he would have made dishonest statements in the past against citizens in court cases to achieve a conviction for the prosecution? How does this happen that so many in law enforcement commit such criminal acts, except that there is an unwritten rule that they will receive immunity to punishment that ordinary citizens would have to endure? The leader of the pack has either had his head buried in the sand or has chosen to whitewash all of the misconduct. Therefore, he should probably resign and allow someone who can exert proper authority and leadership. And I just thought that was a very poignant, well-spoken statement by Elizabeth, and pretty much echoes what the residents of Logan County were feeling. So going back to the murder investigation. So remember, we still got, the whole thing coming out with the case. We had like ballistics testing and all that other stuff still coming out. Well, in late December 2005, the Ohio Bureau of Identification and Investigation, I'll refer to them as the BCI, issued the report on the DNA investigation of the crime scene. They had tested all the DNA, gone through it, and they had the results. Now, some thought the report was inconclusive, but as always, the local authorities maintained that Scott was the shooter. So the locals still speculated that Scott was not the shooter, someone else had done it and framed him, and much to Sheriff Henry's dismay, the BCI report that came out about the DNA evidence did nothing to sway the residents. So BCI technicians had tested DNA that had been collected from the trigger of the murder weapon, along with the stock and barrel of the gun. The DNA also included blood and human tissue samples taken from the barrel and muzzle. Now, according to the state crime lab, DNA tests link the blood and body tissue found on the gun to Scott. And Scott was also the only one found with gunshot residue on his hand. Now, the report estimated that the chances of that DNA belonging to anyone else other than Scott as 1 in 26.34 quadrillion. Now, some professionals thought that this didn't really prove anything, though. After all, they said if someone else had shot Scott first in the back of the head, behind the left ear, and had then placed his hands and body on the trigger and in position, for the second shot, there would be residue on Scott's hands, and his DNA would be found on the gun. So basically saying, this doesn't really prove anything, though, because, if you were going to stage this, of course Scott's DNA and tissue samples would be on the gun, Other questions that were brought up were okay, if this .22 rifle was used to kill 5 other people, why was there no DNA or tissue evidence of anyone else other than Scott on the gun? Did someone wipe the rifle clean before, shooting Scott. And there were also some who thought that positioning of Scott and Page's body on his bed had been, like, staged. There was something not right with it, just as Chief Murray had. And it wasn't just the locals of Logan County who kind of, like, questioned this report and, you know, what the findings actually meant. Professionals from across the country spoke about, like, what they thought of it. So Ken Betts headed up the Miami Valley Regional Crime Laboratory for 35 years, and he pointed out the significance of the presence of blood and tissue on the gun, particularly on the muzzle and barrel. And he said, quote, crime scene investigators typically do not find a victim's DNA on a firearm used in murder cases unless the victim was shot at very close range. However, technicians often find blood and tissue on guns used in suicide. The book then asked why Kay, Megan, and Paige did not have blood or tissue on the weapon because they too were shot at close range. And according to the book, they say that no one has offered an explanation for this. Dr. Lee Lehman, who had conducted the autopsy on Scott, and I think the others as well, said that it is rare to find a gunshot wound inside a murder victim's mouth, but that it was common in suicides. Quote, Scott sustained 2 gunshot wounds, one that traveled from below the jaw and upward into a sinus cavity, and the other one inside the mouth into the brain. Both wounds had evidence of contact burns from the muzzle blast. But apparently there were some experts who actually disagreed with Dr. Lehman's conclusions. Some thought that the shot below the jaw was subjective. The crime scene photos of Scott clearly show the first contact wound behind the left ear above the jawbone, and though this first shot may have indeed traveled into Scott's sinus cavity, its upward movement was only a few degrees, which I guess is not the implication left by Dr. Lehman that the rifle was held under Scott's chin before it was fired. And I guess there was some odd statement that the book pointed out that was in Dr. Lehman's report, and it stated, quote, the autopsy findings are consistent with the ruling that Scott shot the victims before killing himself. Apparently other experts in the field were befuddled by this, like, particular phrasing as well, because they asked how would an autopsy conducted on other victims conclude and prove that Scott was the shooter? I guess that was the question that they had. There was also a second series of tests conducted that also found gunshot residue on Scott, but experts argued that no one should use these tests, like these particular tests that had been done, as the sole basis for determining what had happened in the shooting. Betts said, quote, there are 2 types of residual tests. One test looks for chemicals found in primers used in centerfire bullets, while the other looks for particles discharged from a rimfire round, such as the .22 caliber rounds used in the Moody Schaefer shootings. It is possible for a person to shoot a gun and have no residuals found on the person. Some firearms, depending on condition and type, discharge almost no residual, and residual can easily be washed off. A revolver with an open breech will discharge more residual than a semi-automatic or bolt-action firearm. Betts also said that it's very hard to plant gun residue on someone. Quote, it is hard to plant gunshot residue on a person, and the type of residual you would get from a .22 caliber rimfire embeds itself into the skin. So Cleon C. Marr ran a firearms specialist business, and he had worked in crime labs in 3 different states since 1963. And at the request of the Bell Fountain Examiner, remember the local paper, he reviewed the state crime lab residue tests. He said, quote, they're not saying he fired a firearm, but the residue is there. A .22 does not produce much gunshot residue. You're more apt to find it from a revolver. Yet even Betts and Marr here stated that although rare, it was possible for someone to shoot themselves twice. Again, not common, but it does happen. But the book I read had a problem with all of these analyses, saying that they all ignored the fact that Scott had used a rifle, not a handgun, at an almost impossible angle for a person to have shot themselves behind the ear. The book claimed that none of these experts offered cases where someone had committed suicide with shots in the head twice with a rifle. And Sheriff Henry was just very angry and resentful that, like, the lab test results from the BCI, like, did nothing to, you know, squash the rumors or, you know, quell people's insistence that Scott was not the shooter. And he told the press, quote, this is consistent with what we were seeing all along. We deal with facts. These are the facts. And we've had 4 investigators from the Ohio Attorney General's office investigating this. He reiterated that they wanted to preserve the integrity of the investigation, but the book I read accused Sheriff Henry of failing to mention some things. The book said that Sheriff Henry did not explain that the crime scene had been tampered with, that some of his own detectives' reports had been fabricated, and that meaningful evidence existed that had not been pursued, including the suspicions that some had about who the shooter really was. And yeah, yeah, we're talking about that mysterious character, the Fixer, and we'll dive a little bit more into him next week when we wrap up this case. So going back to Stout, right? Remember he was facing some pretty big consequences for, sexually assaulting a minor, He'd already gotten, fired, thankfully, but now, right, the state was investigating him. Well, unsurprisingly, Stout was indeed found to have acted in a criminal manner, duh. So his case was put before the grand jury in January of 2006. And remember, Special Prosecutor Scott Longo represented the state at the grand jury hearing. And though Stout did have an attorney, Greg Lewis, he was not present. I don't think he was allowed or something. Now, Stout waived his right to remain silent, and he decided to testify to the grand jury. Oh my god, guys, some of the quotes I'm about to pull from this asshole. Oh my god. So yeah, Stout wanted to testify to the grand jury and recount the story in his own words. Now, Stout began with going on and on about his stellar law enforcement record, alright? How awesome of an officer he was. How he had never before been accused of things like sexual misconduct before. This was despite the fact that before this, alright? Before Stout took the stand, Longo had questioned 2 high school girls who I believe had also testified before the grand jury, who admitted that Stout had caught them with drugs, but had offered to overlook that fact if they gave him sexual favors in return. In fact, it is said most of the girls at Riverside High School knew about Stout and the other, quote, perverted road warriors, as they called them. Stout then reiterated for the jury how he had primary custody of his 3 children, not his first wife, and he boasted how he remarried to a second wife and how he was like a father to her 15-year-old daughter. We know how he is with 15-year-old girls. I hope to God he never did anything to her. He then went on to disparage the Schaefer Moody family, talking about how law enforcement was always involved with them. Quote, the sheriff's office has been dealing with the Moody Schaefer problems for a long time. Since the beginning of my employment, I've been dealing with these people for domestic violence, for sexual misconduct, for accused molestation, vandalism, pretty much anything you can imagine. He then went on to talk about how the police were warned about the history of the family after the murders had been called in. Stout then went on about how he had taken on the burden of being the liaison officer between the Moody family and the police department. He emphasized the relationship between 25-year-old Jason Southerly and 37-year-old Kay, repeated what Jason had said about wanting Stacy originally, and then went on to disparage Stacy. Quote, Southerly also states that Stacy dates a lot of men. He makes reference to her mom taking her to Pennsylvania to spend a weekend with her boyfriend, which would be another adult male. Remember, Stacy is 15. Yeah, we know she's 15, you pedo pig. Why did you have sexual contact with her? Why did you sexually assault her? Stout then went on to emphasize Andrew's testimony about how he had spent the night with Stacy. Then he said that Stacy was drunk and horny, had called Andrew, who again he emphasized was 19, to come over for sex. Quote, when he arrived, they immediately went to bed together. After they had sex, he said they went to sleep in the same bed all night. Again, Stacy was 15 years of age. Denny was 19. He states to me that's the second time he's been at the home. After priming the jury to believe that Stacy is some, drunken, horny skank, Stout then went on about the different accounts that Stacy had given police. Remember, she had changed her story a couple times, probably due to the police kind of hounding her and telling her what she was saying wasn't true. Stout painted her as unreliable, a liar, and an overly sexual teen. He then went on about how it was the Moodys who had invited him into their lives. And he made it sound like it was such a burden having to take care of the Moody family while working the case. He implied several times that Stacy, 15-year-old Stacy, had tried to seduce him several times. Classic, right? Classic argument from pedo pigs. He then recounted the accusations that Kay had levied at Steve during the divorce. Remember that he had sexually molested Stacy? And he implied that Steve may have. Quote, Steve Moody wasn't sure the father of Scott Moody might have been Sherry Kay's dad, the grandfather. We had to do a DNA test to decide. With the sex drive Stacy Moody appears to have at a young age, I would guess maybe Steve Moody may have molested her. Also, Audrey Moody accused Bill Sadler, Stacy's physical therapist, of being too friendly with her. I was number 3. I was the 3rd person to be accused of touching her inappropriately. What would you be thinking if you're on this grand jury, guys? He recounted the times that he was alone with Stacy, insisted that she harassed him into each of these encounters. When recounting the Red Lobster date, he stated he wanted to get fast food, but, quote, she absolutely carried on that was not going to happen, and we were going to go out to eat somewhere nice, referring to Columbus, Springfield, or Lima, when I was actually against, but I unfortunately said, yes, I'll do that, as long as her parents were okay with it, which they were. So we went to Red Lobster in Lima, even though I told her I can't afford Red Lobster. Stacy replied, I've got money Mom and Dad don't know about. Just tell them you paid, whatever. He told the grand jury that at the McDonald's date, Stacy told him that Bill Sadler had touched her inappropriately. And this was after Stout complained that it took a really long time for Stacy to eat food, because remember, she still had like a bunch of feeding tube and stuff like that. Remember we talked about that, how she had to eat like soft foods and stuff. Yeah, this was after he complained of her taking too long to eat like a chicken McNugget meal. He then went on to say that Stacy told him that Audrey told her that Scott wasn't the shooter. Quote, the truth of the matter is, they didn't want the brother to be the one that did it. That would cause all kinds of family financial problems if Scott was the shooter. I think Steve Moody may have thought Stacy was involved in it. He spoke to me about it, saying, John, I'm scared a little bit for my kids here. What if Stacy is involved? She's not showing any emotion. She's not been upset, and she's not been crying. I'm a little nervous about this. I said I really need to talk to her one-on-one so I can get this out of her, find out what's going on. And he said that was the premise of that drive over to the abandoned farmhouse, you know, on that long road. Quote, and she came forward and said, my brother's the shooter. I just saw him do it. Everything I've told you is correct. I just don't want to accept it. Mom keeps saying things making me think that maybe I'm making this up. That's what they want me to think. And then to end his gross bullshit testimony, Stout again emphasized that it was the Moodys who had always contacted him. Quote, one thing I guess I want to get across to you folks is these people were calling me. These people were very persistent with me. I know phone records were pulled. Anytime you check a phone record with these people, they've called me from somewhere, either from a cell phone or home phone. I've either immediately answered or called back. I didn't call these folks. I didn't request any of this. This was all done by them. And then Longo got his turn at Stout, and it was glorious. He highlighted all the times that Stout had been alone with Stacy, despite Stout thinking that she was a promiscuous, no-good teenager, you know? Longo started out with emphasizing how much the Moodys had trusted Stout, and had trusted him so much they allowed him to be alone with their minor daughter, and who, by the way, at the time was still recovering from her gnarly injuries. She had to be extremely careful what she ate, or she could choke. We mentioned that before. So, you know, it could take Stacy up to an hour to eat a small meal. Longo highlighted how the Moodys had trusted Stout so much that they had allowed him to take her alone to eat, knowing that it was really dangerous for her. Now, again, so against this, Stout deflected, saying, well, the Moodys didn't seem all that concerned about her condition. Longo then went over the give head joke that Stacy had said earlier and got Stout to admit that it was an inappropriate joke to make. And then he went on about Detective Brugler's own testimony about how touchy-feely Stacy was, but not with him or any other officer. Only with Detective Stout. Longo said, quote, but like bumping hips, never with him, but with you, fooling around in that way. Would you agree with that? And Stout told him, quote, she liked to poke you in the chest, and she'd give you a bump, and that is correct. Longo then moved on to Audrey's concerns about Stacy's physical therapist, this Bill Sadler guy, and how Audrey had confided in Stout, asked him to look into him, and Stout admitted that yes, this had happened. Audrey had talked to him, quote, I know what kind of man Bill Sadler is, and I informed Audrey, and that he was cut off by Longo, and, you know, asked, what do you mean by kind of man? Like, what do you mean by that? And Stout responded, quote, he's an odd man. I can see him doing this. And I informed Audrey, now it's probably best to just keep them away from one another. So after laying all that out for the jury, Longo then asked Stout if he ever told Audrey about this touchy-feely behavior that Stacy had exhibited, or about the giving head comment, that maybe Stacy was acting beyond her years. Like, did he tell Audrey or Steve about this, like, you know, promiscuous behavior that he thought Stacy exhibited? Stout admitted that he never mentioned any of this kind of behavior to either of the Moodys. Despite Audrey even making a comment to Stout how she was worried that Stacy liked adults, Stout just emphasized, well, you know, Stacy had gone over to live with them, but, you know, she hated her stepmom. So I'm guessing he thinks that that gives them not a right to be informed of their daughter's behavior. Who cares if she didn't get along with her stepmom? Like, that's still a guardian parent figure in her life. They absolutely deserve to know if, you know, you're seeing this kind of behavior, you know? But as we know, you know, Stout is a pedo pig, and he loved this behavior. But then Longo asked Stout, quote, and you didn't, as a detective who had just been alone with a 15-year-old who says she likes to give head, didn't say, know what? I'm never going to be alone with this girl because she may be trouble, did you? Stout said, well, he dealt with these kind of people all the time. Longo again got Stout to admit that he did still spend time alone with Stacy and just really hammered more on like everything that Stout had concealed from the Moodys. Quote, all right, you describe in your statement an incident when she comes out after school with the Hooter shirt on that had been turned inside out because it was an inappropriate shirt for school, and she takes off her shirt in front of you. She has a bra on and turns it back right side out, and you describe that as being completely out of line. A bra is a bra and a swimming suit's a swimming suit, and that's inappropriate behavior. Is that a fair characterization you made? Stout said that he was, quote, shocked when Stacy did this in front of him. And that's when Longo again got Stout to admit that he never informed the Moodys about this incident either. Basically hammering in like all the times like, wait a minute, you're saying she's this promiscuous teenager, she's no good, blah, blah, blah. Yet you never told her parents about any of this, and yet you continued to spend multiple times with her alone, you know? Just doesn't make sense, right? Longo then moved on to the Red Lobster date and zeroed in on the fact, the odd fact, by the way, that Stout had radioed in to the dispatch. Remember we talked about that, how he radioed in to the dispatch and lied and said he had some case to work on in Lima, so he'd be gone for a while. Where Longo was really hitting in on this specific point. The reason he was is because even to Stout's own admission, which Longo got him to admit on stand, Stout rarely used the radio and rarely radioed into dispatch. Instead, he used his Nextel cell phone to, stay in contact. That was the primary contact method that he used to get in contact with the department. Longo then reiterated that according to statements, Stout had called into the department that day to say that he was going to Lima, but Stout denied this on the stand, saying, quote, that's what the detective, Consolo, tried to say to me, but I don't recall calling anyone and saying that I was going to Lima. I'm the second in the division, myself and a supervisor at the sheriff's office. Detective Jeff Cooper is the only one above me. If I recall correctly, on that date he was off, so he, Consolo, tried to say I radioed on the radio some ridiculous thing. I don't remember what it was. It was kind of comical to me. And Longo then asked him, like, wait, are you saying you, as a detective with the Logan County Sheriff's Office, get to just, keep your own hours and, work whenever and wherever you want? And Stout said no, just that, quote, we've got open reins on what we do. Obviously, if some of the rumors around town are to be believed, right? So after all of that setup, Longo then moved on to the non-existent stakeout that Stout had taken Stacy on. And when Longo brought the subject up, Stout said, quote, okay, I apologize, I might not have discussed that. And then Longo let Stout tell the court what really happened. Now, Stout said that the stakeout was something he had planned before, but not with Stacy, he claimed. And that's when Longo asked, quote, what do you mean? Whose idea was it to go on the stakeout and have Stacy go with you? And Stout replied, quote, Stacy. So he was saying that the stakeout at the tractor plant, factory, whatever, was already set up and that Stacy had invited herself to it. Stout admitted that he didn't know how long they had been there. Longo then asked Stout if he had told the Moodys that his partner, Detective Brugler, would be on the stakeout as well, which, as we know, was bullshit. And this was when Stout, on the stand, right, before the grand jury, got very defensive. Quote, at Stacy's request, she called on Friday evening and said she was bored, which was common for these people. We're all sitting here bored. There's nothing to do. What are you doing? Oh, nothing. I'm going to be going to work in a little bit. He said Stacy wanted to come along and see what the cops really did on these stakeouts. She asked if anyone else was going to be there. He said no. And that's when Stacy allegedly told him, quote, well, they won't let me do that. Stout said that was the end of it, and then he got a call from Audrey. Quote, a couple of hours later, I get a phone call from Audrey. Stacy's wanting to come out and ride with you tonight. Are you okay with that? That's fine. We have people ride with us all the time. I don't mind, especially when it's something boring like that when you're sitting there staring at a building for however long. So Audrey says Stacy said that several of you guys are going to be out together. That kind of threw me for a loop, just like the oral sex comment. I made a poor decision and said, yeah, there will be others out there, and I shouldn't have said that. But Longo wasn't letting Stout away with that easily. Quote, you don't recall telling Audrey and Steve that, hey, we've got to get going. We've got to go pick up Mike? You don't remember saying that? Stout said that he did not. Longo then said, oh, so when everyone else testified, then they were just mistaken or, lying, right? And Stout just deflected. Quote, I don't recall saying anything like that. And I would say at this point, I wouldn't believe anything they said. So, and that's when Longo cut him off. Quote, you're before a grand jury admitting to at least going along with a lie. And Stout admitted yes. Longo continued, quote, and you're telling the grand jury that you wouldn't believe anything the Moodys would say, but aren't you in fact telling them that you were part of this lie? And Stout said, quote, I am sitting here today with you folks on my own free will will. I'm trying to be open and honest with you. This is not common for a person to be sitting in this position, being accused of something, but I want to tell you people what happened. I am telling you that I went along with that and I should not have. It was wrong. Longo moved on to the activities of that night, the drive along the rough areas, including Stout's own home. Now, Stout was adamant about not knowing exactly how long he had been with Stacy that night. Longo said, quote, clearly the stakeout part of the night was over with and you spent 3 hours just cruising around. Stout said, quote, no, if I say I was up at the lake for an hour, well, yeah, I guess you're right. If I was out from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., it would be 2 to 3 hours. That would be correct. Longo pressed on, quote, going here and there, maybe stopping by Children's Services parking lot to take a leak. Stout said yes, and that's when Longo began his attack. Quote, now, I'm not that familiar with Logan County, but I'm somewhat familiar with where the sheriff's office is, which is probably not too far around the corner from Logan County Children's Services. He got Stout to agree to this. He continued on, quote, I mean, you were doing official work, a stakeout, you had a ride along with you. Did you think of just stopping at the sheriff's office and, taking care of it there? Stout said, quote, no. I mean, I could have, yes. I could have, but I didn't. I don't know how to say this appropriately. I'm a born and raised country fart, At home, it's nothing for me to open the back door and go pee instead of going to the bathroom, just being the way I am. I believe I told the investigator that I was going through the parking lot and making reference to what the buildings were, and I stopped and got out and peed. I also believe I told him that I walked over to the bushes and did so. He's telling me that the incident that I'm being accused of was that evening in the parking lot. I find it odd if I just performed oral on her in digital penetration, inserting my finger in her vagina without being rude. Why did I go walk around the corner and take a leak versus apparently I was just naked with her? Why not just pee right there? Sure, I told the investigator that I walked around the building. The other problem I have is apparently I performed oral sex on her, which I don't do to my wife, either of my wives. If you confront my ex-wife or my current wife, I don't perform oral sex on them. But I didn't refuse to perform oral on her, and so it's all for her, none for me. I guess without being rude, I find that very odd. Can you believe this is what this asshole is saying before a grand jury? Can you believe it? This is why I love using quotes. People's own words sometimes just blows your mind. Longo then moved on to Stout's assertion that Stacy chased him, talking about the phone calls that she would place to him and how they could last for as long as an hour or two. Stout said that Stacy was confiding in him, that she hated her life, hated living, hated Audrey, etc., etc. They went over how Stacy began feeling comfortable with Stout, how Stout picked her up from school, that Stout claimed was all set up by Audrey and Steve, and how they would spend time driving around. Longo said, quote, and you told Detective Consolo that after you would eat, you would drive around for a while, sometimes as much as a couple of hours. And this is when Stout again became defensive. Quote, no, I better be careful what I say. As I said, it would take her sometimes an hour to eat a 4-piece chicken McNuggets meal and fries. I may be wrong about that. It would take her sometimes up to an hour to do just that. I would take her out, driving her around. She was interested in what I did, showing her, and he was cut off by Longo, quote, you're saying that after that hour, you'd spend perhaps another hour or more just driving around Logan County with this 15-year-old or 16-year-old girl, depending on when she turned 16. And this is when Stout grew visibly tense. Quote, your job and my job are two different jobs. My job may consist of driving around Logan County for 8 hours and not talking to a soul, or my job may be working in Logan County for 12 hours interviewing people. So part of my job is to drive around and again, Longo cut him off, quote, so you're just going about your regular job and you just happen to have a 15 or 16-year-old girl with you to ride along during those times? And Stout said yes and emphasized that it had all been set up by Audrey. Longo then talked about the accusations against Stout and how his own supervisor, Detective Cooper, had told him not to have any contact with anyone associated with the case. And Stout said, quote, I understand what you're saying here. When the incident came out about the news release, Detective Cooper blew a gasket because the Moodys bashed us. They really did bash the sheriff's office for not doing a proper investigation. It looks like there's some mass murderer out there. So that does sting a little bit. He blew up. Do not have any contact with the Moodys. Hell with the Moodys. Stay away from them. Another day later, but again, he was interrupted by Longo, again, wanting to zero in specifically on Sergeant Cooper's instructions to Stout about staying away from the Moodys and not to have contact with anyone associated with the case, including Detective Brugler. But Stout remained adamant that he was only told to stay away from the Moodys. Stout had been in contact with Brugler after the accusations came out. He told Longo that Brugler was, quote, very upset and very concerned. But Longo told Stout, quote, he described you as being nervous and upset. And Stout just said, quote, well, I've never been put on administrative leave before, so And again, Longo interrupted him. He also said that you were apologizing to him because you used his name when you lied and told the parents he was coming with you on a stakeout, but that he wasn't going to be there. And Stout, without outright admitting this, just said, quote, I would apologize to him for even this going on at all. Yes, that's very possible. Longo then moved on to the birthday card, which Longo made Stout read out loud what he wrote, and Longo got Stout to admit that it was his own handwriting in the card. But again, Stout, trying to deflect, went on some rambling statement about how, like, the family wanted him to come to 2 birthday parties that they were throwing for Stacy, how they kept inviting him, how he didn't want to go to either one, and he didn't want to be involved with them. Quote, again, these people are calling me and wanting me to be involved in all these things, and I said no, and I didn't do it. So sometime after her birthday, I gave that to her. Now, at that point, Longo and the prosecution had no further questions for Stout, but members of the grand jury had questions for Stout. One of them asked him, quote, I'm having trouble understanding why you kept being alone with this girl, knowing she's promiscuous and a known liar. Why would you continue to put yourself in that position? I know in my position, I would never do that. And Stout just retorted to this jury member, quote, okay, I deal with people every single day. As an officer, I was in this position every single day. If you listen to the interview, I had a goal here. I knew there was more to this story than what I'm being told. This case was closed. It was closed 10 days after it happened, but I really wanted Stacy to open up to me and tell me what happened that day. And that's the aggressive nature of myself. If anyone knows anything about me, I'm an extremely aggressive officer. I love to get the truth out of people. That's what I do. And I deal with crack addicts, female sex workers on a weekly basis that are offering these same things that she said. I can handle it. She made reference to offering to give me a blowjob. I wrote it off as was noted. Okay, whatever, and kept on driving. Wasn't interested. I have sex workers doing the same thing too. Whether you folks recognize that in Logan County or not, there's multiple sex workers offering oral sex to us, myself, weekly. Roll off it. You don't do it. I can handle it. And another juror commented to him, quote, I deal with kids on a daily basis. I didn't put myself in that position. And this is what Stout's response was to that juror. Quote, I bet if you thought about it, you would. And the juror was like, no, I wouldn't. Longo then pounced on Stout at this point and said, quote, you came in here with excerpts of supplements that you did because as a detective, you're trained to document everything. Isn't that right? But you didn't supplement what Stacy told you during these lunches and the hours in the car and the stakeout. You didn't supplement your case file with those comments, did you? And Stout responded, quote, I don't supplement anything that I talk about with people in the car. I supplement casework that I'm doing and not general conversations. I don't record general conversations, ever. And Longo just said, quote, so is it a general conversation that you're after when you were going on these lunches and the stakeout? Or were you after the goal, and that was to find out what the truth was? Was it a homicide or was it a suicide? Stout just replied, quote, my goal was to get her to tell me what happened that day, yes. Longo said, quote, you think Stacy has it out for you? And Stout said, quote, I've got a couple different ideas as to why this happened to me. Why this happened to me? Fuck you, pedo pig. You did this to yourself by being a pedo pig. At this point, court broke for recess, and oh boy, the grand jury members were not liking Stout at all. Now, even though they weren't supposed to, they did discuss the case, somewhat amongst themselves. Because, remember, again, I'm going to emphasize this, small community, everyone knows everyone, things get around. Everyone knew on this jury, everyone knew about the Stouts, like old family gun shop and how they did a lot of things under the table. Other members of the jury had known many of those who had been killed. And at this point, it is said that the grand jury members just felt disgusted with Stout. And they thought it was just inexcusable and detestable how he had violated Stacy's trust. This 15-year-old teenager who had just been traumatized and lost her whole family. You know what I mean? They were disgusted with him. And that is where we will end part 3. Yes, we are still not done with Stout and his rambling on in front of the grand jury. This is when they broke, so this is where we will end part 3. And next week, we will wrap up our look at this case. And oh man, so we'll get into, what happens with Stout. We'll get into all of the theories and stories that the locals have about who they think did this. And there's so much more to get into. It's mind-blowing, right? Isn't this case wild? Isn't it intense? I was really disgusted when I read the book and, read about what Stout did to Stacy. I was disgusted. It's so fucking gross. It's so gross. Like, I'm in my mid-30s, and the thought of, like, a teenager, the thought of someone in their early 20s grosses me out. Like, I don't understand, as a grown-ass adult, why you would be attracted to teenagers. It's disgusting. And on top of that, the fact that, you know, he's in a position of authority and power, you know, like, just makes it all that much more egregious. Once again, remember, this is the book that I am reading for the case, where I got a lot of nitty-gritty details. The Saving Stacy book by Rob St. Clair. Thank you so much to Smash the Bug for recommending this case to me. I can't remember if I shouted you out in the beginning. I don't think I did. So yeah, shout out to Smash the Bug for pointing me in the direction of this case. There's a lot of fishy stuff with this case, man. Just a lot. Well, I am gonna go ahead and let y'all go. I've rambled on enough. I hope you have, you know, safe and happy week out there. Hope things are going well. Hope the summer's going well for you. Winter, if you're on the, you know, other side of the globe. And yeah, until we meet again next week, take care of yourself. Remember, don't be a dickwad. Don't be a douche. Don't be a pedo pig like Stout. Leave a little sparkle wherever you go, and just leave that positivity and that brightness that is you out there, all right? Alrighty, that'll do it. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. See you next week. Bye-bye.